Moonlight Letters. The wind whispered through the tall pines outside Chris's window, their rustling leaves composing a song only the night could understand. The moon hung low in the sky, casting silver light into his dimly lit apartment. A cluttered wooden desk sat by the window, covered in scattered sheets of paper, broken pencils, and an untouched cup of coffee gone cold. Chris leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples, frustration deepening the crease between his brows. His fingers hovered over the typewriter keys, but the words refused to come. He had been staring at the same blank page for hours. Chris muttered to himself, "Damn it! Not a single good sentence." With a heavy sigh, he pushed away from the desk. Chris is a young, handsome, but lonely writer who lives in an old apartment near the countryside, struggling with writer's block and isolation. The isolation of the countryside had once been a muse, but now it felt like a prison. No distractions, no voices, no company, only the silence that stretched endlessly, mocking him. His thoughts were interrupted by the distant sound of footsteps. Not his own. Not the wind. Something or someone had passed by. Frowning, he stood and grabbed his coat, shivering slightly as he stepped outside. The night air was crisp, carrying the scent of damp earth and pine. The gravel crunched under his boots as he made his way down the narrow path leading to the apartment's rusted mailbox. When he opened it, his brows furrowed. Among the usual junk mail and bills was something peculiar. A cream-colored envelope, thick and elegant, sealed with a deep red wax stamp. The wax bore an unfamiliar symbol, intricate and ancient-looking. Chris glanced around. The road was empty. No sign of the mailman, no visitors. Just the stillness of the countryside under the watchful eye of the moon. Curiosity tightened in his chest as he carefully broke the seal and unfolded the letter. The paper was smooth, the ink slightly faded as if written with a fountain pen. His eyes scanned the delicate handwriting. To the one who finds this letter under the moonlight, there are words I have longed to share. Secrets carried by the night's whisper. If you are willing to listen, I will write again. Until then, look to the moon, and you will know I am watching too. There was no name, no address, no explanation. Chris exhaled slowly, the crisp night air carrying a thrill down his spine. A prank, he murmured, but his gut told him otherwise. Holding the letter tightly, he turned back toward his apartment, his writer's mind already weaving stories around the mystery. For the first time in months, he felt something stir within him. A spark, a curiosity, a reason to write again. The apartment was silent except for the occasional creak of the old wooden floorboards beneath Chris's pacing footsteps. The letter sat on his desk, its words looping elegantly across the page, as if pulled from a time-long past. He ran a hand through his dark hair, eyes scanning the letter for the 5th time that night. Dearest stranger, the moonlight carries whispers of the past, of love and longing that never fades. Have you ever felt it? The way the night embraces you, making the world feel less lonely? Perhaps you do not know me yet, but I know you. If your heart is willing, I will write again. Until then, watch the moon and remember, love transcends time. Maria. Chris exhaled, shaking his head. Who the hell is Maria? He muttered, tossing the letter onto the desk. It had to be a prank. Maybe some local trying to mess with the reclusive writer in the countryside. Or maybe an old letter someone had mistakenly left in the mailbox. And yet, he turned toward the window where the moon shone bright and silver, casting long shadows over his bookshelves and typewriter. There was something unsettling yet intriguing about the letter. The way the ink had slightly faded, the way the words felt too personal, too intentional. But he wasn't going to be fooled. With a dry chuckle, he picked up the letter and shoved it inside a drawer. Nice try, Maria, he murmured. The next night, the air outside was crisp as Chris stepped out, stretching his tired muscles. The wind had picked up, rustling the trees, carrying a faint scent of rain. He hadn't written a single word all day. He sighed, making his way down the gravel path to the mailbox. His fingers hesitated before lifting the rusted lid. Inside, among the usual junk mail, was another envelope. This time his breath caught. It was identical to the first, cream-colored paper sealed with wax, but what sent a chill down his spine was the way his name was written on the front in that same delicate handwriting. Chris Carter. He swallowed hard and glanced around. The road was empty. The countryside stretched into darkness, silent except for the whispering wind. No one had been here. No one had knocked on his door. With unsteady fingers, he broke the seal and unfolded the letter. Dearest Chris, I hoped you would read my first letter. Perhaps you think it a trick of the wind, a game played by shadows. But I assure you I am real, and so is my love. Have you ever felt like you belonged to another time? Have you ever dreamed of a past that wasn't yours? If so, then you will understand. I will write again. Until then, look to the moon and know that I am looking too. Yours, Maria. Chris's heart pounded. His fingers tightened around the letter as a cold shiver ran down his spine. This wasn't just an old letter someone had lost. Someone knew his name. Someone was watching him. Chris sat at his desk, the latest letter spread open before him, the soft glow of the lamp illuminating its delicate script. The ink, though slightly faded, was still legible. He traced the elegant loops of Maria's handwriting with his fingers, his mind unable to dismiss the growing unease, mixed with fascination. He exhaled sharply, rubbing his temple. This is insane. Yet, he couldn't ignore the way the words pulled at something deep inside him. Another letter. Dearest Chris, you must think me a ghost or a figment of your imagination. But I am neither. I was a poet. I once lived in this town, in a small cottage by the river, long before your time. I spent my days weaving words into verses, waiting for someone who never came. I loved him, though we never met. I knew him through letters, through whispered words carried by the wind, and now somehow, I know you. Do you believe that love can transcend time? That two souls destined to meet will find a way no matter the years between them? Until my next letter, look to the moon and know that I am waiting, just as I always have been. Yours, Maria. Chris leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling, his thoughts tangled. A poet? 100 years ago? He frowned, shaking his head. This is ridiculous. It has to be a prank. But who would go through so much effort? The handwriting was unlike anything he had ever seen. Elegant, deliberate. The wax seals were not something easily faked, and the way the words resonated within him. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. This was starting to feel personal. Too personal. Another letter. Dearest Chris, do you ever sit by your window and let the night speak to you? I used to do that. I would watch the river reflect the moonlight and wonder if he, my beloved, was watching the same sky, in another place, another time. But fate was cruel. He never came. And so I wrote to him, letter after letter, knowing he might never read them. I wonder, if I had met him, would I have been happy? Would he have loved me the way I loved him? Perhaps in another life, I would have known the answer. Perhaps you know the answer now. Tell me, Chris, do you believe in fate? Yours, Maria. Chris exhaled, gripping the letter. This wasn't just some historical tale. It felt like a confession, a soul pouring out its grief, its longing. And he felt it. Each letter brought Maria closer to him, as if she wasn't just a name from the past, but someone real. Someone reaching out across time. His heart pounded as he whispered, "Who are you, Maria?" And more importantly, how was she writing to him now? The night was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that made even the faintest sound seem deafening. Chris sat at his desk, another letter in his hands, but this time, something was different. His fingers brushed the ink, and and it smudged. His breath hitched. "The ink is fresh," he murmured, his pulse quickening. That was impossible. The previous letters, though old-fashioned, had always been dry, as if they had been written long ago. But this one, it had been written recently. By whom? Chris's heart pounded against his ribs. This wasn't just a coincidence anymore. Fresh ink. A letter from a woman who supposedly lived 100 years ago. A love story that never met its end. Shoving his chair back, he grabbed his laptop, the glow of the screen illuminating his anxious expression as he typed furiously, "Maria, poet, tragic love story, countryside town, early 1900s. Dozens of results flooded the screen, but one caught his eye, a local historical archive. Clicking on it, he skimmed through the entries until a name made his stomach drop. Maria Langley, 1892 to 1913. His throat tightened as he read, Maria Langley, a poet known for her melancholic verses, lived in a small cottage near the river. She wrote letters to a man she had never met, believing their souls were connected. Tragically, she passed away at the age of 21. Her letters, found after her death, were never sent. For years, they remained unread, until they mysteriously stopped appearing. Chris's fingers hovered over the keyboard. His blood ran cold. The letters stopped after her death. Then how were they appearing now? And why were they addressed to him? His gaze flickered to the unopened letter, still sitting on his desk. For the first time, fear and fascination twisted together inside him. This wasn't just a story anymore. Maria was real. And somehow, impossibly, she was writing to him. The night was colder than usual, the wind carrying a hushed whisper through the trees as Chris made his way to the abandoned house at the edge of town. His boots crunched against the gravel path, his heart pounding with every step. Maria's letters had led him here. Each one had hinted at a place where words were born and love was left unfinished. After hours of searching through historical records and old town maps, he had finally found it. The ruins of Langley Cottage, Maria's home. Now, standing before it, he hesitated. The house was a skeleton of what it once was. Its walls were cracked, vines creeping through the broken windows, and the wooden door hung loosely from its hinges. But even in its decay, there was something hauntingly beautiful about it, as if time itself had refused to let it fully crumble. Chris swallowed hard, then stepped inside. Inside Langley Cottage. Dust swirled in the air, disturbed by his presence. The wooden floor groaned under his weight. The scent of aged paper and damp wood filled his lungs. His flashlight flickered as he swept it across the room. There, against the farthest wall, sat an old writing desk. His breath caught. The desk was covered in dust, yet the items on it, the inkwell, the quill, the stack of parchment, remained untouched, as if someone had just stepped away moments ago. Chris ran his fingers over the surface, brushing away years of neglect. Then, something made him freeze. The latest letter, the one he had received just last night, lay open on the desk. How? His voice barely escaped his lips. He had left it at home. Before he could react, the candle on the desk flickered, then burst into flame. Chris stumbled back, his heart hammering. The air grew thick, heavy with something unseen, and then a shadow moved. His breath hitched as a figure slowly materialized in the dim candlelight. A woman. She stood just beyond the desk, her silhouette soft and wavering, as though she was caught between two worlds. A long flowing dress clung to her delicate frame, and dark curls cascaded over her shoulders. But it was her eyes, deep, sorrowful, and filled with something achingly familiar, that stole his breath. She spoke, her voice like a whisper carried by the wind. You came. Chris's throat went dry. Maria? She smiled, a mixture of relief and sadness. I've waited for you for so long. His pulse roared in his ears. This isn't possible. Maria stepped closer, the candlelight flickering against her ghostly form. Neither were my letters, and yet you read them. Chris shook his head, struggling to breathe. I don't understand. You're real? Maria smiled softly. As real as the words I wrote. His mind reeled. How is this possible? You died. I read about you. You were waiting for someone who never came. Maria shook her head. No, Chris. She took a step closer, her voice tender yet laced with sorrow. I wasn't waiting for him. Chris frowned. What do you mean? She exhaled, her hands clasped in front of her. For years, I believed I was writing to a man I had never met. Someone I convinced myself was my fated love. But deep down, I knew. Those letters were never meant for him. Chris felt a chill run through him. Then who were they for? Maria's gaze softened. You. His breath caught in his throat. I didn't know your name. I didn't know the time in which you lived, but I knew that somewhere, someday, someone would read my words and understand. She paused, searching his face. Someone who knew loneliness the way I did. Someone who searched for meaning in the quiet of the night, beneath the same moonlight I once gazed upon. Chris's hands clenched at his sides. His entire life he had felt like something was missing. Some invisible, unspoken connection just beyond his reach. And now, standing before Maria, he realized what it was. You wrote to me, he whispered. Maria nodded. Across time, across fate. I wrote to the one who would answer. Chris shook his head, overwhelmed. But why me? How could you have known? Maria's lips curved into the faintest smile. Because you found me. Silence hung between them, heavy with a truth that neither could deny. Chris ran a hand through his hair, his mind spinning. This is impossible, he murmured. But even as he said it, he didn't quite believe it. Maria stepped closer, her form flickering slightly, as though the moment itself was fragile. And yet, here we are. Chris's heart pounded. What happens now? Maria's expression darkened, her voice quieter. I don't know. Her form wavered again, like ink dissolving into water. Chris instinctively reached out, but his fingers passed through empty air. No, wait. Maria's eyes locked onto his, pleading. Chris, I don't have much time. The letters brought us together, but time is pulling me back. I need you to understand. Chris clenched his fists. Understand what? Maria smiled, a smile laced with both sorrow and hope. That love, real love, always finds a way. And with that, the candle on the desk flickered violently, then blew out. Darkness swallowed the room. Maria was gone. Chris sat at his desk, staring at the flickering candle. The room felt empty without her presence, without the warmth of her voice. His hands trembled as he unfolded the last letter that had appeared out of nowhere, resting in his palm like a whisper from fate itself. The ink shimmered under the candlelight, fresh as if it had just been written. If you believe in love, meet me under the moonlight. One last time. His heart clenched. He had spent his life writing about love, about longing, about connections that defied logic. But this? This was beyond anything he had ever imagined. And yet, he knew. He believed. Without hesitation, Chris grabbed his coat and ran into the night. The sky was bathed in silver, the full moon hanging low and luminous, casting long shadows across the ground. The abandoned house stood as it always had, silent, forgotten by time. But tonight, something was different. Chris slowed his steps as he reached the threshold. The air shimmered, waves of light undulating like ripples on water. His breath caught as he saw it. A portal. It hovered in the air just beyond the writing desk, a glowing doorway of silver and blue, like moonlight woven into fabric. The air around it hummed with quiet energy. And on the other side, Maria. She stood just beyond the threshold, her dark curls cascading over her shoulders. Her eyes filled with an emotion so deep it threatened to pull him under. She was radiant, more solid than before, yet still not quite of this world. She reached out her hand. You came! Chris took a shaky step forward. How could I not? Maria's lips parted slightly, her expression a mix of hope and sorrow. This is the moment, Chris. The moment where fate asks you to choose. His pulse thundered in his ears. Choose? Her fingers hovered just inches from his. To stay or to go. Chris's breath hitched. What happens if I step through? Maria's gaze softened. Then time will rewrite itself. You will no longer belong to this world. He looked over his shoulder, back toward the empty road, the life he had known. A life of solitude, of searching for something he hadn't even understood until now. Then he looked at her. Maria, the woman who had reached across time, whose words had touched his soul before he ever saw her face. There was no choice to be made. Chris stepped forward, their fingers brushed, and the world shifted. A rush of wind swept through the room, pages of old parchment swirling in the air like whispers of forgotten love. The portal pulsed, its glow intensifying. Maria's eyes widened. Chris, but he only smiled. I believe in love. And then, the light engulfed them both. The room faded, the past and present became one. And love, the kind that defied time itself, found its way home. The air around the portal shimmered like liquid silver, pulsing softly as if alive. The glow bathed Maria's face in ethereal light, making her seem even more otherworldly, beautiful, untouchable. Chris stood at the threshold, his heart pounding. His fingers hovered just inches from hers. One step, and he would be with her. One step, and the world he knew would cease to exist. He wanted to, God, he wanted to. But something deep inside him, something unshakable, held him back. He thought of his life, of his family, of everything that grounded him in reality. If he stepped through, he would be erasing himself from that world. He would never see another sunrise, never hear another autumn breeze rustle through the trees outside his apartment. He would become a ghost in his own story. Maria saw the hesitation in his eyes. Her smile faltered, but only for a moment. Then, she nodded in understanding. You can't do it, she whispered. Chris swallowed hard. I love you. His voice broke on the words. But I don't know how to leave everything behind. Maria's eyes shone with unshed tears, but she didn't plead, didn't try to convince him. Instead, she smiled, a soft, heartbreaking smile. Thank you, she whispered. Chris frowned. For what? For finding me. For reading my words. Her voice was barely audible over the hum of the fading portal. That was enough. The light around her flickered. The portal wavered, collapsing inward like a dying star. No, wait! Chris reached out, but his fingers grasped only air. Maria's form blurred, her presence dissolving like mist in the morning sun. And then, she was gone. The portal vanished, leaving only silence in its wake. The abandoned house was just that once more. Dusty, forgotten, unchanged by time. Chris stood there, his breath uneven, his hands shaking. He felt hollow, as if a piece of him had been ripped away. The air still held the faint scent of old parchment and candle wax. But the letters, her letters, were gone. Forever. The next morning, Chris sat at his desk, staring at a blank page. The silence of his apartment pressed in around him, the weight of loss settling deep in his chest. And then, he picked up his pen. The words flowed like they never had before. He wrote Maria's story, every word, every longing, every moonlit whisper. He poured her existence onto the pages, making her real in the only way he could. And when the book was published, when people read her words and felt her soul within them, Chris knew Maria would never be forgotten. She was eternal. The end.